Welcome again to Commander's Tech. Continuing our exploration of propaganda, so far we've looked at the use of disingenuous claims and accusations of colonialism and imperialism, and the way Russia and China have used imperialism to delegitimize the West, all the while engaging in the same behavior they are condemning. We've also looked at appeals to the good nature of Western liberals to defend the rights of indigenous peoples, all the while identifying former settler colonists as indigenous, in the case of the Crimean Tatars and the Zulus. Now, let's look at the mechanics of a national propaganda campaign, largely perfected by the Nazis, and its continued use in recent geopolitical events. The big lie. How do we make people accept and believe claims that are grossly removed from reality? That is, they are a big lie. The Nazis used big lie propaganda to demonize the Jews, but part of the strategy is to claim that your opponent is the one propagating the big lie. The Nazis claimed the Jews pioneered the technique to smear ethnic Germans over the defeat in World War I, in the stab-in-the-back legend. Essentially, they claimed that Germany was not defeated in the war, but when the armistice took place, Jews, controlling the country, forced a shameful surrender and a peace settlement on the nation in order to destroy Germany. Of course, this is ridiculous. By the fall of 1918, Germany's military had neither the men nor materials to continue the war, and the Jews were quite personally invested, not just financially but personally, in Imperial Germany, and they even made up a disproportionate amount of the army. As an aside, and for some more perspective, Anne Frank, the famous Holocaust victim, both her father and her uncle were decorated World War I veterans from the German army. The technique has been described as such. If you tell a lie big enough and keep repeating it, people will eventually come to believe it. The lie can be maintained only for such time as the state can shield the people from the political, economic, and/or military consequences of the lie. It thus becomes vitally important for the state to use all of its powers to repress dissent, for the truth is the mortal enemy of the lie. And thus, by extension, the truth is the greatest enemy of the state. So, if the lie is an obvious lie, how could this work? Wouldn't people tune it out as asinine? From my observations, it's simpler than we'd expect. Really, most people don't watch the news, they don't study history, they don't much care about politics or global affairs. They often get the news passively, catching a part of a news broadcast when they're waiting at the car mechanic, getting their brakes fixed, or when they're waiting in the waiting room at the dentist's office. By filling the airwaves and the media with the lie, people who aren't thinking about it will begin to absorb it. Psychologically, reading the same pieces of information from multiple unrelated sources makes the brain begin to assume that there is some underlying truth to it, even if you know objectively that there isn't. When the issue becomes relevant to people's lives, for instance during an election year, or when global events bring it home for the general public, people will go to the most immediately accessible and understandable sources to get their facts. And if those sources are the propaganda lie, then the lie becomes their truth. It is very difficult to overcome a wrong first impression. The first time I really started to think about all of this was actually during the 2016 election. When Trump entered the race, I said to myself, I've heard about Trump my whole life, but I don't know much really about him at all. only that he's supposed to be a rich, successful businessman. So I ask myself, what companies has he run, or products and services does he make that I use every day? I started to research his businesses and his history, and I'll be honest, I was disgusted. He had run no real companies, only family firms. His business made no products and provided no services. Apart from an exclusive golf club that few could afford, most of his business was simply licensing and branding of his own name and image as a successful businessman. There's some circular logic there. The foundation of his fortune was not a successful startup or an invention, but inheriting control of $400 million in the early 1980s. On the other hand, I had Clinton fatigue and a bad taste about the Clintons in general. I started to ask myself why. By the 2016 election, the Clintons had been the target of nearly 30 years of propaganda, resulting in a vast, highly documented, but under even cursory examination, completely bogus history of crimes. This repetition of Clintons as criminals had been going on through the 90s and 2000s, reaching a fever pitch with Benghazi and the email scandal. I became aware of Pizzagate in the lead-up to the election, and I immediately recognized it as another tired repetition of 1980s satanic panic idiocy and psychosis. Benghazi was beating a dead horse over something that she had no power to prevent, and the email server issue was another big nothing, at least to anyone who understands how email works and who paid attention to the details of the investigation. Despite all that, repetition of these lies caused even Democrats to have difficulty shaking the feeling that the Clintons were tainted, somehow. In the 2020 election, we again had competing accusations of the big lie, and in increasing areas. This time, the Trump campaign claimed the election was rigged even before the election occurred, and began flooding the media channels with these claims from election night on. Essentially, Trump proxies claimed that the voting machines were rigged to flip votes and or were being remote controlled by foreign agents. I have nearly 20 years' experience in networking, web development, and systems administration. The claims being presented by Mike Lindell, Sidney Powell, etc., and promoted on Fox News, among others, were little more than technical gibberish. In fact, their claims only made sense if your tech knowledge came from watching CSI. The collected data from Mike Lindell, when it was presented for analysis, on examination, it either showed nothing or it directly contradicted their claims, which suggests that they either didn't realize the worthlessness of their data or the impossibility of their claims, or they assumed that everyone else was too stupid to check. Similarly, in all the recount drama, particularly in Arizona, many of the accusations and demands from groups like the Cyber Ninjas were actually gotchas meant to elicit a confession, which also failed. There was so much demand for the elections board to show the Splunk logs that it became a slogan amongst Trump supporters. But, of course, they didn't know what Splunk logs are. Splunk is a cloud-based, that is, internet, application logging and monitoring utility. It's very useful. I've been working with it since 2016. As cloud-based software, it requires an internet connection to collect and analyze data. If the machines were offline or air-gapped, there would be no Splunk logs until the system is able to reconnect and sweep the CIF logs, which will create a large dump of data when they connect. And that is exactly what the Splunk logs showed. No logging between October and February, when the machines were offline, or more specifically, were air-gapped for the election. Really, the Trump campaign claimed that government and court denials of election fraud constituted a big lie. But really, it was repetition of the lie of a rigged election that led Trump supporters to believe the election was illegitimate, and leading directly to the January 6th riots. Enough about politics, though. How has this been used in wars in recent years? Well, big lie propaganda is central to the Ukraine and Gaza wars. Nearly everything coming out from both sides in the early stages of the Russian 2022 invasion of Ukraine was propaganda, but the Russians made the greatest and wildest use of the big lie. The Russian propaganda was at times reminiscent of Baghdad Bob from the 2003 Iraq invasion, as their official statements didn't seem to mesh at all with objective reality. From their claims of NATO biolabs in Ukraine, through their stated justification that Ukraine, with a Jewish president, was a neo-Nazi state, none of it made much sense. A little black metal aside here. As you may know from past articles and videos, I am a big fan of dark rock and heavy metal, and I was involved in the black metal scene back in the day. With the fall of the Soviet Union, Russian youth became obsessed with heavy metal in the late 80s, and Russia has maintained a healthy underground metal scene to this day. In the 90s and the 2000s, Russian underground metal produced a very fruitful and innovative black metal scene, and the jewel in Russian black metal was Blazebirth Hall. Maybe it's like in the early days of punk, where Nazi imagery was adopted to shock the older generation. But the bands in the Blazebirth Hall circle, including Forest, Brannical, and Ravendark, were quintessential NSBM, and they made no secret of their neo-Nazi and anti-Semitic ideology. Ukraine had bands expressing similar attitudes, like Nocturnal Mortem and Hate Forest, but most of them grew up eventually, and they created a greater and less controversial artistic vision. The point is, while Ukraine does have neo-Nazis present and visible, so does Russia, and Russia has more of them. From the start of the war, as I read Russian propaganda, I could not figure out what Putin was on about, calling NATO and Ukraine Nazi organizations. It seemed juvenile and clearly demonstrably false. Until I realized that Nazi means something completely different in Russia than it does in the West. In the US, when we think of Nazi, we think German ethno-nationalist fascism, with brutal repression of political and ethnic minorities, particularly the Jews. In fact, the anti-Semitism is practically the defining feature. We need to remember, though, that in World War II, the Western Front was practically a sideshow, distracting the Germans. The real war, where most of the fighting and dying occurred, was in Russia and the East. The Russians didn't see the anti-Semitism of the Germans, including their attempts to exterminate the Jews, as being particularly remarkable. The Russians are just as anti-Semitic, and had made their own efforts to exterminate the Jews over the years. Instead, the Russians consider the defining feature of Nazism to be anti-Russian, particularly refusing to acknowledge Russian supremacy or insisting on national and cultural identity distinct from Russia, at least for Eastern European countries, like Ukraine, Latvia, and Lithuania. This confusion over definitions is then conflated intentionally in Russian propaganda to make Westerners perceive the invasion as being justified to stop the evil of a resurgent Nazism, ignoring that the Russians behave in a manner closer to what we think of when we think Nazi. This propaganda narrative has continued to be used with even bigger lies as a way to tell the West that Russia is strong and represents the way of the future, insisting that Ukraine will fail any day now, and the only reason the West wants to prop it up is that all the proof of Clinton, Obama, and Biden crimes is hidden somewhere in Ukraine. In the other major global conflict going on currently, that of Israel and Gaza, we see in real time the attempted application of big lie propaganda, and it can be dizzying to someone who tries to remain open-minded. The October 7th, 2023 attacks were well documented, even live streamed by the attackers. And Israel delayed their response by several weeks to make sure all assets were in place and all options to avert war were explored. The entire Hamas strategy in the war is one of propaganda and information warfare. That is, using the big lie combined with deliberately endangering the lives of Palestinian civilians to attempt to sway global popular opinion. Hamas has denied responsibility for the October 7th attacks, despite their own video evidence, insisting that it was an Israeli false flag. And they placed their military assets in civilian-protected areas like hospitals, schools, and UN offices. As a result, IDF operations are sure to result in civilian casualties and the destruction of civilian infrastructure. Overall, Hamas and other Palestinian groups claim genocide and are quick to show dramatic images of localized devastation, repeating the claims ad nauseum until bleeding hearts in the global media begin to believe them. The big lie is effective because so many people are incurious to the point that they simply don't know any better than what the propaganda says. Combine that with suspicion of established elites and of the government, and they can be convinced that the sky is green and the moon made of cheese. Modern anti-globalists talk endlessly about forever wars and wealthy elites, suggesting that these are a product of capitalism and democracy. They assert that the way forward is to reject modern liberal democracy. They only offer a return to a corrupt autocracy and a form of economic fascism as an alternative. We do have wealthy elites today, but the wealthiest were entrepreneurs from modest, that is, middle-class backgrounds who, through drive, intelligence, and luck, created business empires, typically by finding a novel solution to a real problem. In the old order, wealthy elites were born into it, and the system prevented people, by design, from the middle classes from ascending to the elite. We know from history where their cure goes. It's merely a return to the great power and aristocracy politics of the 19th century and earlier. Historically, this leads to forever wars and to a concentration of wealth and power in elite families, which is exactly what they claim to be trying to escape. I've been saying for years that the real conspiracy is an attempt by certain elites from Russia, Hungary, China, and some conservative circles in the West to roll back modernity, returning to the power structures from before the French Revolution. In such a system, there is no law and justice. The elites are literally above the law, and they are not subject to it. And the world, in those days, was racked by forever wars, as the elites threw blood and treasure at each other in meaningless interpersonal squabbles.